Okay, sorry for getting a late start here today. We're going to do a little bit on, talk a little bit into this week's prophecy update about what I view as an attack on free speech, and also Israel Imperiled. And you'll see a little bit more as I flesh that out. Again, just as a reminder, each week we talk about these different things that are talked about in the prophetic scriptures that seem to be coming together. By the way, there is a National Day of Prayer this week. It might be a good time to take some time and pray for the leadership in our country and for a national repentance, because we certainly need it at this point. But we talk each week about this convergence of events and these things that seem to indicate that ultimately the second coming of the Lord is getting closer and closer. I use this verse a lot. I'm going to read these verses again from 2 Timothy chapter 3 again this week, because I think, again, a lot of what I have to say this week relates to these particular verses. This know also, Paul writes. And remember this, Paul's writing this near the end of his life. Could you give me a glass of thing of water, Pam? Paul's writing this near the end of his life. He's in prison in Rome. He's awaiting certain executions. So the things that he writes are really what's on his heart, what he considers to be very important. So he writes to Timothy, and he says this know also that in the last days perilous times shall come. And they are perilous times. They are very disconcerting to a lot of us as we watch and see things that are happening. I get communications from people all the time about, couldn't you be more positive? And I'm like, I am. I'm positive that things are falling apart. And but look, ultimately we win in the end, and that's what we have to remember. That's where our hope ultimately lies. And I do think that what I see is that the Lord is working in the faithful remnant church to decouple us from the things of the world and to bring him back to himself. And that sometimes happens only under times of very extreme distress. And so when that happens, and we know that it's part of God's prophetic plan, we ought to be like Daniel. Remember in Daniel chapter 9, Daniel's reading the scroll of Isaiah. He picks up the scroll, and he realizes we've got this captivity that we're in was supposed to be 70 years. So what does Daniel do? And does he say, all right, we're going home? No. He gets down on his knees and he prays, repents. And I think that's a perfect example for how the church should be acting in these last days. So, verse 2, for men shall be lovers of their own selves, covetous, boasters, proud, blasphemers, disobedient to parents, unthankful, unholy, without natural affection, truce breakers, false accusers, incontinent, fierce, despisers of those that are good, traitors, heady, high-minded, lovers of pleasures more than lovers of God, having a form of godliness but denying the power thereof. From such turn away. For of this sort are they which creep into houses and lead captives silly women laden with sins, led away with divers lusts, ever learning and never able to come to the knowledge of the truth. And boy, does that ever describe the world that we live in today. Now, I just want to give you a little bit of an update on a couple things. First, my thing today, I'm going to do sort of a review or follow-up on some of the things I talked about last week. And this is just a little bit of a preview of things that I'm working on. This is a cover story in the new Christianity Today, or as some people say, Christianity Astray zine. And it's talking about Bethel Church. Or is this real revival? Kingdom Come in California. Bethel Church in Redding, California has become extremely influential. Tim Worth, who works with Moriel TV, who's here today, has done some work on this. You might look up his videos on Moriel TV and on Tim's YouTube channel, Tim Worth, W-I-R-T-H. They're very well done. And the evidence of things coming out of Bethel that aren't so good, in my view, is mounting by the day. They become extremely influential. They have a local church that's affiliated with Bethel here in the Columbus area. I know when I was in California about a year and a half ago, there was a church that had just recently started and was drawing over 2,000 on Sunday nights almost immediately. They have very well done music from a technical standpoint, but they also do things that are that just make no sense to me, frankly. Okay, I've been around the church all my life. I've seen everything come and go. Going out and laying on the graves of dead people to soak up their spirit. This is not even remotely biblical stuff, folks. So to the extent that there might be some biblical stuff there, I don't really care because it's so overwhelmed by the nonsense that I see. I'm also working through some videos from this Azusa Now thing that took place out in Los Angeles a few weeks ago. And some of the stuff I see in that is just, I mean, there's a guy there who's prophesying about somebody in the crowd, reading it off of his cell phone, okay? That's not prophesying, folks. It's reading stuff off your cell phone, okay? That's not miraculous. I could sit up here and read stuff off my cell phone, too. And if you thought that was miraculous, you got a problem. And it was a lot of things like that. A lot of things are very troubling about that event. In Bethel Church and their musical group, Jesus Culture, were very integral part of that. Bill Johnson, the pastor you see in the photograph up there, was one of the speakers there. So we'll be dealing with that more in the weeks to come as I get through some of those videos and have some more concrete examples. But some of the stuff there you ought to flee, I guess is what I'm saying. Now, I want to talk a little bit about the attack on free speech. This is an editorial from the Wall Street Journal the other day called "The Climate Police Escalate." Now, if you remember, a few weeks ago, and I'll mention this in just let's set it up. A subpoena hits a think tank that resists progressive orthodoxy on climate change. Now, I told you a couple weeks ago there was a group of attorney generals from about 13 states, including the Virgin Islands and Washington, D.C., that have gotten together and said, we're going to go after the companies that don't fall into line on climate change because they're lying. Okay? If they have a different view, they don't have the same view of science, they're lying, they're not orthodox, they're defrauding people, so we're going to go after them. And they are. Okay, I played that clip, I think it was 3 weeks ago in my update. And now what are they doing? They're going after the people that they don't like. And they're attacking them. This is fascism. This is what rogue governments do. There is a thing in the United States called the Constitution. And until the court changes, and this election is in great part about a change in the court, until the court changes, the Constitution still says we have a right of free speech. Now, I saw an article in the Atlantic by Erwin Chemerinsky, who is the dean of the University of California at Irvine Law School, very influential constitutional scholar, man of the left, and he said, boy, it'd be great if we had a liberal majority on the Supreme Court, finally, and not have these guys like Scalia and everything gumming up the works for the progressive agenda. And he admits it, and he says, look, we would get rid of Citizens United, which allows corporations the right of free speech. We would get over this nonsense about gun laws and having the right to bear arms, and the Keller decision that came down a couple years ago. That's what they want. This is what will happen if you have a liberal court will allow this type of nonsense to proceed. Listen to this editorial. Sometimes we wonder if we're still living in the land of the free. Witness the subpoena of Claude Walker, Attorney General of the U.S. Virgin Islands, demanding that the Competitive Enterprise Institute cough up a decade of emails and policy work, as well as a list of private donors. They have no legal obligation to disclose their donors. No organization does. That does not matter to these people that are pushing this agenda. They are coming after people. Why? Because they want to shut down anything that does not fit their view. Go look at the protests that are taking place at various political rallies. Do those people want to have a dialogue? Do they want to talk? Do they want people to have free speech? They want to shut down anything that bothers them. Mr. Walker is frustrated that the free market think tank won't join the modern church of climatology So he has joined the rapidly expanding club of Democratic politicians and prosecutors harassing dissenters. New York Attorney General Eric Schneiderman started the assault last autumn with a subpoena barrage on ExxonMobil. His demand for documents followed reports by Inside Climate News and the Los Angeles Times that claimed Exxon scientists had known for years that greenhouse gases caused global warming but hid the truth from the public and shareholders. The truth is, the scientists working with Exxon had a whole range of views on things, okay, but that doesn't matter. Mr. Schneiderman nonetheless says he is investigating Exxon for defrauding the public, defrauding consumers, defrauding shareholders. He wants to use the Exxon case to shut down all climate change deniers. Okay, Mr. Schneiderman, if you're such a pure ideologue, I'll tell you what, stop using gas in your car. Stop flying on jets and stop having people drive. Get them on a bike to go serve the subpoenas on Exxon. How about that? Otherwise, you're just a big fat hypocrite like everybody else, in my view. I'm a little exercised about this today, by the way. This is how I get my workout. And this is I played this clip. Al Gore was there, all these attorney generals, that's Eric Schneiderman in the middle, talking about it. Now, listen to this. Mr. Walker, that's the Attorney General of the U.S. Virgin Islands, is also over the line in demanding the names of nonprofit CEI's donors, who can remain secret under federal law. Anyone on the list will become a new target of the Schneiderman climate posse. Rhode Island Senator Sheldon Whitehouse has also asked the Justice Department to use the RICO statutes to bring civil cases of climate dissenters. Remember the clip I played of Attorney General Loretta Lynch saying, yeah, I'm referring things for an investigation on this. Attorney General Lynch recently referred to the FBI request from 2 Democratic congressmen seeking a criminal probe of Exxon. Democrats on Capitol Hill have sent letters pressuring companies to disavow the Chamber of Commerce for its climate change, for its climate heresy. This is a dangerous turn for free speech, and progressives ought to be the first to say so lest they become targets for their own political heresies. Rather than play defense, the targets of the climate police need to fight back with lawsuits of their own. Boy, is that ever right. Another place where I see this coming attack on free speech is in this whole, I don't even know what to call it. I don't even know what to call it. Do we call it transgender policy, bathroom policies? You know what I'm talking about, the thing with Target and all this stuff. And folks, look, let's use some common sense. It's not so much Starbucks comes out and says, we have a transgender bathroom policy. Well, that's really brave, okay? In Starbucks, some people love Starbucks. I don't drink coffee, so I don't really care that much. But if you love Starbucks, that's fine. But it's not that brave for Starbucks to come out because all Starbucks are little. They're all single-stall bathrooms. The problem is men pretending to be transgender going in there and assaulting females, which we hear reports of all the time. And the people that and people just ignore it. They act like it doesn't happen. And there are reports in the news every day about this. And that's what the issue really is privacy of women and children. Here's Jen Hatmaker, who is, I don't really know her. She's, I believe, a Southern Baptist. She's become a very popular speaker in the conference circle. She came out this last week and just said, I'm all for this. She says, this is where I am. Gay teens, gay adults, mamas and daddies of precious babies, friends and beloved neighbors of very dear LGBT folks. She's very close, I believe, to Beth Moore. They kind of work together. So whatever the cost and loss, this is where I am. She goes on and says, here are my arms open wide, so wide that every one of you can jump inside. You're so dear, so beloved, so precious and important. And there are groups out there now called, there's a group I became aware of this week called Lead Them Home, which is going around to churches, religious organizations, church organizations, denominations, conferences, to talk about how to welcome, and they use the acronym in there. I would put it up. I forgot to put it up. You've heard of LGBT. It was LGBTQ. IA, and then a plus sign. So it was questioning is the cue, intersexual, then asexual, and then, well, whatever weird thing we haven't come up with or even talked about. And this is infiltrating the church. This is mainstream evangelicalism is kowtowing to this stuff. And corporations are doing it. This, for example, there was a Fourth Circuit opinion this week that Title IX has never been applied in this area, but the Fourth Circuit, they don't care. They went ahead and they've applied this to transgender issues. So a young man who wanted to use, it says here, the Fourth Circuit of Appeals confirmed on April 19th that transgender students who are restricted from using the bathroom consistent with their gender identity can sue the school district under Title IX. The court overturned a district court dismissal of a Title IX case by Gavin Grimm, a transgender boy who was preventing from using the boys' restroom and locker room. That is a problem. The Fourth Circuit pointed out that the district court failed to defer to the Department of Education's established position that Title IX requires schools to ensure transgender students' restroom access. The Institute, or the National Center for Transgender Equality, we welcome this sensible and very important decision that promotes fairness and dignity for all students by holding that a trans student who was denied access to a restroom has a vital Title IX claim. We urge the U.S. Department of Education to swiftly issue guidance to all schools regarding their obligations under Title IX. You know what's going to happen? You don't do this, no funding from the feds. You're going to lose millions, even billions of dollars. Okay, now is this trying to bring people into line? Corporations are doing it. Here is the NCAA. Board of Governors approves anti-discrimination process for championship bids. Okay, here's the statement from somebody on the NCAA Board of Governors.
Today, the NCAA Board of Governors passed a resolution governing championship sites and where we hold tournaments, particularly in regard to RFRA laws that exist across the country. We need to make sure our student athletes are competing in venues and competing in states that have an inclusive environment for all of our student athletes, our fans, and our coaches. The NCAA is a national organization that's looked at to have great competition. It's important for us to weigh in on these important issues and make sure that regardless of whether our students are a Division I, Division II, or Division III athlete, that their championship experience is among the best.
Okay, I mean, because it's been that big of an issue, right? So if a city does not have what the NCAA wants, you don't get a championship event in any division of NCAA. They've now become the thought police and the discrimination police in their mind. Just wait till the first 6'5" transgender male wants, 6'9" transgender male wants to play female basketball or something like that. Let's see what the NCAA does with that one. Will they be discriminatory then? Now I hesitate to share this next one because it's so out there that I don't think you will believe it, and I'm not sure how to discuss it delicately. So I will only put up for you part of the headline, and I think you will figure it out. This comes from the Daily Mail in England, and its students are, I don't know why he got in there so many times. Students call for sanitary bins to be placed in male toilets for transgender men. Okay. Does anybody not? I'll tell you what, if you don't understand the insanity of that, see me afterwards, okay? Or go see my wife. She'll explain it to you. And because there are certain things that don't happen to males every month that happen to females. Okay, now are you following me? But they want to pretend like they're going to happen to males who are really not males. So we have to accommodate them. And these are student organizations. Now, knowing that that happens, do you think we have an education problem? Okay? We do, writ large. Okay. So now I'm going to focus over on Israel. It's not a very easy transition, but I don't know how else to do it. Now that I've probably lost everybody who's trying to figure out this. If you're scratching your head, that's a good sign. If this doesn't make sense to you, you're okay. Okay? Feel good about yourselves. A lot of things going on in the Middle East, particularly in Israel and Jerusalem. Israel, there's this talk about putting cameras on the Temple Mount. Jordan wanted to do it. Israel said, yeah, that's a good idea. Then I guess because Israel said that they wanted to do it, they would go along with it. They haven't put them up there. Part of that is it would give documentation to attacks that are being made on Jewish and other worshipers that go up on the Temple Mount. They're getting kicked off of there. They're arrested if they even appear to be praying. If you've been to Israel, you'll be told, don't look like you're praying, because they follow you around when you're up there. They listen to everything that you say. There have been clashes this week on the Temple Mount. There was a lot of hullabaloo about, there's a peace agreement. They've agreed to divide the land. They're about ready to agree to divide the land. They're going to vote on it in the UN. It's already a done deal. I don't think so. Mahmoud Abbas has gone back to Palestine after being at the UN a couple times recently, and he's in trouble with the other Palestinian leadership because he didn't present a resolution to criticize Israel for the settlements that are being built in Judea and Samaria. So the fact that he's under fire for not doing it ought to be evidence that it didn't happen. Now look, there is this push to divide the land. There is this push for a two-state solution. It still exists. It's not really... A lot of people question whether it's viable, whether it's going to happen. I personally think that there will be an attempt at a two-state solution at some time. Benjamin Netanyahu may not be in office forever, and there are other people in Israel that are pushing for this. But there is a pretty broad spectrum of people in Israel that know that it's a bad idea. It will lead to another intifada, in my judgment. Look, in the United States, we have, by most estimates, 12 million to maybe 30 million illegal immigrants. And when somebody comes up with a policy that we're going to deport them, at least temporarily, what is the response? You can't do that. It's too expensive. That would never happen. Okay, well, let's go over to Israel. What do they want? Deport every Jewish person out of Judea, Samaria, back to Israel, inside the 1967 lines. If you look at the numbers of the settlers, 400,000 or more, compared to the total population of Israel, it's a much higher percentage. So when our president says we can't deport people here because it's just too expensive, but Israel will have to do it on a greater scale than we would proportionally to the population. I think that's called hypocritical. I think it's pretty easy to see. There's a lot going on in Israel. We talked last week about the fact that within the Syrian proposed peace agreement that was being talked about, there was apparently a provision that would have given Syria, the Golan Heights, back to Syria. Now, the fact that Syria can't even manage the land that it already has, that it's falling apart, that thousands of people are dying, and this week hundreds more apparently died in attacks on Aleppo and other places, they want to give the Golan back to Syria. And this is what the world wants to do. And so the fact that in response to that, Netanyahu took his cabinet up to the Golan, had a meeting up there and said, this is Israeli territory, and we are not giving it up. And the world has just gone, The EU came out, the U.S. State Department came out, the federal government, administration, the UN Security Council had meetings. There were other things. Depkafile reported this. Depkafile sources report that just like the other diplomatic or military steps initiated by Obama and Putin in Syria, such as those for Assad's eventual removal from power, the two powers see a resolution of the Golan issue as a gradual process that may take a long time, perhaps even years. But as far as they are concerned, Israel will have to withdraw from the Golan at the end of that process. It should be noted that Prime Minister Netanyahu is not traveling to Washington to discuss the Golan issue with Obama. The frequent trips by the Prime Minister, senior officials, and top IDF brass to Moscow in recent months show where the winds are blowing in the Middle East. However, Moscow is not Washington, and Israel has no lobby in the Russian capital defending its interests. It should be very clear that the frequent trips by senior Israeli officials to Moscow have not created an Israeli policy that can influence Putin or other senior members of the Russian leadership. Putin has made occasional concessions to Israel on matters of minimal strategic importance, but on diplomatic and military steps regarding Syria and Iran, he has shown little consideration of Jerusalem's stance. Now, depending on your view of Ezekiel 38 and 39, that might make you very excited. It should also be noted that there's been no basis for the enthusiasm over the Russian intervention in Syria shown by Netanyahu, Israeli ministers, and senior IDF officials. All of the calls by a number of Russian experts, mainly those of Depkafile, for extreme caution and ties with Putin have fallen on deaf ears among the political leadership in Jerusalem and the IDF command in Tel Aviv. Amid these developments, three regional actors are very pleased by Washington and Moscow's agreement to demand Israeli withdrawal from the Golan: Syrian President Assad, the Iranian leadership in Tehran, and Hezbollah leader Hassan Nasrallah. Now they do not need to risk a military confrontation with Israel over the Golan because Obama and Putin have essentially agreed to do the dirty work for them. Great. And so what was the response of the Organization of Islamic Countries? 57 countries, 57 states. I think there were 57 states back when some candidate for office mentioned 57 states. Just pointing it out, not making any not asking you to draw any conclusions from that. So in response to Netanyahu's claim, Golan is ours, we're not giving it back, and in view of the situation in Syria, in Iraq, in Egypt, in the Sinai, in the Islamic State, in Turkey, all over the Islamic world there is war. Civil war, terrorist attacks. So the Organization of Islamic Countries called an emergency meeting to discuss peace in the Middle East, right? No, it was to criticize Israel. So they all got together. This is a few weeks before that at their big meeting in Turkey, in Istanbul. But they came out with a resolution. Condemn the continuation of the Israeli occupation of the Palestinian territories, increasing violations of the international humanitarian law by... And listen, by the way, there's an Islamic State in Syria and Iraq, ISIS, sometimes called the Islamic State. There's an Islamic Republic of Iran. There's an Islamic State in Saudi Arabia. So there's a lot of Islamic states. And we know how they treat people. We know how they treat women. We know how they treat minorities and that type of thing. And so put that in context of these people are criticizing Israel. By further expansion of the illegal settlements and the demolitions of Palestinian houses, the arbitrary killings, widespread illegal detentions, and the ongoing blockade of Gaza. Take all measures to safeguard the Islamic identity of Al-Quds al-Sharif against the Judaization attempts of the occupier and the violations against the sanctity and status of Al-Haram al-Sharif. Confirm the full solidarity of Muslim countries with the Palestinian peoples in their struggle to free themselves from the 49-year-long Israeli occupation to achieve life in their own sovereign and independent country with Al-Quds and al-Sharif as its capital. Continue to strongly condemn all forms. These are the Islamic countries. Continue to strongly condemn all forms of intolerance and discrimination based on ethnicity, race, color, religion, and belief, and emphasize the importance of nurturing tolerance, respect dialogue, and cooperation among different cultures, civilizations, and peoples as the most effective way to combat against the scourges of racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and Islamophobia. Refuse sectarianism and doctrinalism in all its forms and manifestations, and encourage national efforts aimed at combating sectarian and discriminatory policies and practices, as well as at enhancing reconciliation among all Muslims. They really need to work on that a little bit based on what I've been looking at. And then this one, commit ourselves to efforts aimed at increasing the effectiveness of the OIC and making justice and peace prevail all around the world. Well, does this not sound like the world is set up for somebody to come on the scene to do this? And it does seem insane that they're doing this in light of what's going on in the Muslim world right now, the Arab Spring and all of that. So there was also, trying to remember, this also came out of the executive committee, what they were going to do, reaffirming all resolutions of the Islamic Summit. They referenced the UN Security Council Resolution 497 from December 17, 1981, that they were deeply concerned at Israel's persistent attempts to defy the will of the international community and its continued occupation and annexation of the Syrian Golan, which are considered null, void, and illegal by the international community. And they're right about that. So they reaffirmed this resolution. I'll skip forward here. One of the things they said was this: they mandate the General Secretariat to coordinate and conduct necessary contacts and consultations to implement the provisions of this communique, including calling on the UN Security Council to condemn the measures taken by the Israeli occupying power, which constitute a clear violation of Security Council Resolutions 242, 338, and 497, and to stress that these measures are null and void and without legal effect. And then they reference, and this is a copy of the Resolution 497 from 1981, it essentially says Israel gets out of the Golan, back to the lines before the 1967 war. There's also this report. There's a report in the Jerusalem Post this morning denying that this is really going on, that there is a fracture in the German-Israel relationship. It's been fairly strong, but Angela Merkel, who has the migration problem that she's trying to deal with politically, now appears to be turning some of her frustration with that towards Benjamin Netanyahu. I mean, when everything's going wrong, the sort of default position in the world is blame Israel, right? That's the easy thing to do. Merkel had repeatedly made it clear to Netanyahu that she believes the effects of Israeli settlement construction in the occupied territories are disastrous. The settlement policy, she believes, makes it unlikely that a viable Palestinian state can be established in accordance with plans aimed at a two-state solution. In other words, Netanyahu, you need to get on board with what the world order wants. Any other approach, Merkel and Foreign Minister Frank Steinmeier are convinced, would ultimately transform Israel into an apartheid regime. Now, I want you to remember that accusation. They accuse Israel of being an apartheid regime. Now, in South Africa, they divided the races. So they're saying that's what Israel is doing. That's not what Israel is doing. There are plenty of Arabs living within Israel. We have a local businessman who is an Arab from Israel who loves Israel. It's the opposite. And you'll see that in just a minute. It is an indication that the times are changing. Even about Israeli supporters like former German ambassador in Tel Aviv, Andreas Michaelis, who is now the Foreign Ministry's political director, expressed opposition in internal consultations to accommodating the Israeli prime minister. The Chancellery has likewise lost hope that the peace process can be revived so long as Netanyahu remains in office. A two-state settlement is becoming increasingly unlikely, wrote the German Institute for International Security Affairs in a recent analysis. The financial and political costs of implementing it rise with every settlement unit needing to be demolished and with every settler needing to be evacuated and compensated. A majority of the Israeli cabinet is now openly opposed to a Palestinian state. One example is Minister of Education Naftali Bennett, who is also head of the pro-settler party, the Jewish Home. Israel cannot withdraw from more territory and cannot allow for the establishment of a Palestinian state, he said in 2015. I'm going to skip this article. There's an article that Caroline Glick writes about the disconnect of the IDF leadership, including the defense minister, about this shooting that took place in Hebron where a Palestinian attacker was subdued and then he was shot in the head and killed by an Israeli soldier who's now been charged with manslaughter. The Israeli soldier, I believe, defense is, look, I didn't know if he was moving around and I didn't know if he had a suicide bomb vest on. He had a heavy coat on and I couldn't tell, and rather than be dead, it was a self-defense. And this has led to there's been big rallies in support of that, but immediately Caroline's problem with that is immediately the response of the Israeli military establishment was to condemn the soldier without looking at the facts. And that's all that she asked is, and she said this is a big change and this shows sort of a disconnect on the part of the IDF. Over in Syria, Aleppo was attacked this week. They essentially destroyed the last remaining hospital in Aleppo, city of, I want to say 2 or 4 million people. It's the largest population city in Syria before the Syrian civil war. They killed the last pediatrician in Aleppo in the bombing raids the other day, even though there was supposed to be, these were bombing raids conducted by the Assad regime to drive out the rebels from Aleppo. And it's going to cause more people to flee and try to immigrate to other places. The Temple Mount continues. This is just a sampling of news from the Jerusalem Post the other day, which just seemed like had article after article after article that seemed like, are they reading the prophets before they make their editorial decisions? The Temple Mount, radical Islam's twisted trump card in the holy war against Israel. Jews ascending Temple Mount are instigating war, a member of the Knesset said. Palestinian UN ambassador compared Israel to the Nazi regime. Certainly, this is a report from the Jerusalem Post that there was technology that was available to Belgium and French authorities that would have helped them identify the terrorists, but because of an Israeli anti-Israel bias, they said they wouldn't buy the technology. And now people are dead as a result. And do you think anybody will be held accountable for that? This report, Syria is finished. Refugees in Jordan see little hope of return to their homeland. Security Council has gotten together to talk about Syria. The violence is intensifying. This report, this is all just from like a 1 or 2 day period in just one newspaper, the Jerusalem Post. Syrian food crisis deepens as war chokes farming. Not surprisingly, it's a little bit difficult to plant your farm when people are fighting and throwing bombs around. People are disinclined to go out in the field, understandable. But it's causing damage to grain silos, to irrigation canals, all types of things that are needed to conduct farming in Syria. And Syria was really a pretty productive country in terms of food production because of the Euphrates and Tigris rivers that flow through there. Well, the Euphrates River, at least. Greece is now bracing for more. At the same time, Assad is getting a deal with Russia to restore some of their infrastructure. It's going to take a lot more than $850 million, I can tell you that. Another interesting thing, this is just from the Jerusalem Post the other day, Iran and Russia move closer, but alliance has limits. That's kind of an interesting development. There's been some fracturing in the relationship. A professor of Mideast and Islamic history at San Francisco State said this, there is a military economic aspect to this alliance which is beneficial to both sides. But on a geopolitical level, Iran and Russia can only form a tactical short-term alliance. That's interesting. Not a strategic one. I think the ideological differences between the two are just too deep. Now I'm going to turn to the student thing, and I'll probably finish up with this. I was going to mention this last week. There was a report in the Jewish Chronicle from Great Britain about a anti-Zionist president being elected head of the NUS, which is the National Union of Students in Great Britain, at the college level. This is a picture of her. She is from Algeria. She is a Muslim, and she has made some very troubling statements in the past. She is part of the left. This commentary says she's symbolic of regressive left poison and she's unfit for office. In 2014, she was criticized for not supporting a motion condemning Daesh. She said then that to do so, Daesh is the Islamic State, ISIS, she said then that to do so would be Islamophobic. Beleaguered Jewish students were also astonished by a discussion over whether to mark Holocaust Memorial Day, with some students claiming that doing so would not be inclusive. You can't make it up. You really can't make it up. Here's a little clip of somebody defending the decision on Holocaust Day.
I am against the NUS and the government forgetting and ignoring the mass genocides and prioritizing some lives over others. And I think instead of commemorating just one mass genocide, I think it's important to have a day to commemorate all the mass atrocities, as it suggests that some lives are more important than others. Instead, campaign for a day to commemorate all of them. Thank you.
So what you're saying is you can't talk about the Jewish Holocaust unless you talk about everybody else that's ever been killed. We can't commemorate this. So we need, I'm going to make up a term, we need a trans-Holocaust policy. Okay, I guess. Bring your Holocaust and everybody will feel comfortable. So she is part of this, these groups. And so here's a comment, here's some things that she said a couple years ago, this young lady who's now the National Student Union president.
As a campaign, we take a vocal and uncompromising anti-colonialist approach to the occupation of Palestine, but at least in the time of my involvement with the solidarity movements here in the UK, there's a few things that do worry us. Namely, the fear that the notion of resistance has been perhaps washed out of our understanding of how colonised people will obtain their physical emancipation. With mainstream Zionist-led media outlets, because once again we're dealing with the population of the Global South, resistance is presented as an act of terrorism, but instead of us remembering that this has always been the case throughout struggles against white supremacy, it's become an accepted discourse amongst too many. When there's a desire to engage in discussions of Palestinian resistance in its many forms and therefore not limited to an armed struggle, the excuse of, well, Palestine's different, or in today's context, things are really different, we can't use the same methods that we did back then, are given amongst many.
So she talks about the Zion, you see how the anti-Jewish terms, the Zionist-led media that she talks about. Now, she's been criticized for it. I'm not anti-Zionist. I use anti-Zionist terms, but I'm not anti-Zionist. I mean, how could you judge me like that? So this is a problem in England. This report from the Times of Israel: Islamic radicalization fuels dire threat to Jews in Europe. Congressional panel hears. There have been some hearings recently in Congress. I'm going to focus on a little bit on this one and then another one. John Farmer, a former New Jersey Attorney General who now leads a Rutgers University initiative to assess how to protect communities vulnerable to terrorism, said terrorist attacks were threatening the viability of Jewish Europe. The situation on the ground has become dire. The challenge to the Jewish communities has become nothing less than existential, he said. Many stalwart Jewish leaders have become ambivalent about remaining in Europe at all. This week there was a hearing, on April 19th, there was a hearing before a joint subcommittee in the Congress, and the title of the hearing was Israel Imperiled. I'm going to play a couple clips from that. I'll try to get the YouTube link to Brian so you can watch the whole thing. Just know that they do some introductory remarks, and then they go vote for about an hour, but they kept the camera on, so the whole thing is really only about an hour long. It had 4 witnesses. One of whom was Michael Rubin, who's an expert on Iran, and this is Dr. Rubin's comments.
In recent years, Iran has developed a number of different surveillance and attack drones. While its claims to have reverse engineered a downed CIA drone are risible, U.S. military pilots flying over the Persian Gulf regularly describe seeing Iranian UAVs. Iran has openly deployed its indigenous UAV technology into Syria and Iraq and perhaps Lebanon as well. Iranian UAVs fly over Syria's largest city in Aleppo and so could just as easily fly over the Golan Heights, the Galilee, or into international air paths over Tel Aviv's Ben Gurion International Airport or Israel's smaller regional airports. That Iranian sources openly brag about their development of both suicide drones and new satellite-guided drone navigation capabilities augments concern. Neither Iran nor its proxies need to be able to strike an aircraft or an airport to be successful. Simply interfering with civilian air traffic will likely augment Israel's isolation as airlines suspend service into Tel Aviv.
He continued.
Nor is the UAV threat the only one looming for Israel. With the discovery of gas fields in the eastern Mediterranean, Lebanese authorities have asserted a claim to 300 square miles of Israeli waters. Therefore, even though the United Nations formally certified Israel's withdrawal from Lebanon complete, the dispute over Sheba Farms notwithstanding, Lebanon has resurrected a new claim that provides Hezbollah cover to pursue its rearmament and terrorism. Indeed, Hezbollah has bragged that it has been training operatives in underwater sabotage. This not only suggests a new terror capability that could be utilized against Israel, but is also a direct threat to many American engineers and oil workers involved in the region.
Okay, so you see there's two threats. There's two threats. There's the Iranian drones that are flying around the Middle East now, and we don't know what they'll do with those. They're bragging that they've developed underwater terror teams to go out and take out oil platforms and gas drilling platforms in the Mediterranean and elsewhere. And then yet another threat, I believe he talks about.
We should not be distracted by notions of the demographic imperative as oftentimes we are now. The Palestinian Statistics Agency.
Now, the demographic imperative is this. Israel cannot become a one-state solution because there are so many Palestinians in the area called the West Bank and Gaza that they will then become the majority group in Israeli politics, and Israel will cease to be a Jewish state. Caroline Glick spends a lot of time in her great book, The Israeli Solution, talking about the fact, I think it's the Israeli solution, one-state solution. She advocates for a one-state solution. And she says all this hand-wringing that we hear about the demographic problem, birth rates are falling throughout the West Bank. In Gaza, they are rising in Israel. This is not a problem. It's not going to be a demographic problem in the future. We can deal with this problem. And so he's saying, essentially, that he agrees with this.
These statistics cannot be taken at face value. They double count Jerusalem. They refuse to count emigration. And if you compare multiple censuses, you notice that the predictions are off by several percentage points and are frankly readjusted with magic numbers. Bad data, even if diplomatically convenient, oftentimes leads to bad policy.
And he's right. Now, the reason I bring this up is there was testimony given of that at that hearing that led to a couple of articles this week by people who I respect as good foreign policy analysts, Brett Stevens from the Wall Street Journal and Caroline Glick from the Jerusalem Post. First, I'll kind of go back and forth between their articles because they both talk about the same thing. And the issue that they're talking about, the title of Brett's article is The Anti-Israel Money Trail. Where is all this money coming to fund people who are anti-Israel, that are part of the BDS movement, the boycott, divest, and sanction movement? They have to be funded because these groups are popping up on campuses all over the country. There are these resolutions being adopted. For example, earlier this month, he says, Harvard Law student Hassam al-Kulak posed a question at a public conference to Tzipi Livni, the former Israeli foreign minister. How is it that you are so smelly? He wanted to know. It's regarding your odor, about the odor of Tzipi Livni, very smelly. Now, he was called on, and there was a video of the event. His comment in question was edited out before Harvard put it up on their YouTube channel. But they eventually were able to root out who it was, because Harvard wouldn't identify him. Because I guess you're allowed to say this about Israeli government officials, and there are no consequences. So it says here, and Mr. L. Kulak, who is active in a Harvard affiliate of Students for Justice in Palestine, remember that, Students for Justice in Palestine, or SJP, later offered an anonymous apology to anyone who might have been offended. And this is a picture of the Students for Justice in Palestine Facebook page. And they are a very active organization on college campuses, universities all over the country. Brett Stevens continues. Yet the exchange is yet another reminder of the anti-Israel and increasingly anti-Semitic environment students now experience on American campuses. That's the doing of several groups, including some nominally Jewish ones. But none is so prominent as SJP, which has more than 100 chapters nationwide and has been canning and pairing itself with left-wing or minority student organizations to sponsor anti-Israel events, heckle pro-Israel speakers, and agitate for boycott, divestment, and sanctions resolutions on campus. SJP's self-declared goal is to end Israel's occupation and colonization of all Arab lands while promoting the rights of Palestinian refugees to return to their homes. That's another way of saying destroying the Jewish state. Yet as prominent as SJP and the wider BDS movement have become, less is known about the source of their funding. That changed last week after the testimony of House Foreign Affairs Committee by Jonathan Schanzer of the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies. Caroline Glick a couple days later picked up the same thing in her column and said this: to defeat the BDS sanctions campaign against Israel, it is first necessary to understand it. The BDS campaign is an extraordinary phenomenon. Activists from the U.S. coast to coast robotically parrot the same lies, employing the same tactics of bullying, intimidating, and silencing pro-Israel activists and speakers on campus after campus. That's why I started this off with the title, The Attack on Free Speech, because that's exactly what's going on. It's happening on anything that the ideological, political left holds dear. They want to completely shut down dissent, not talk about it, not dialogue about it, not argue about it, not listen to opposing views. Shut it down. They do that with Trump rallies. They don't want Trump to speak. They want to shut him down. Their goals are uniform. They seek to silence pro-Israel voices in U.S. academia as a means to destroying general public support for Israel in America. And they seek to make Jew hatred socially acceptable in elite circles in America for the first time since the Holocaust. And believe me, back at the time of the Holocaust, there was a big problem with Jew hatred among monetary elites in this country. Henry Ford, for one example, was a rampant or a very strong anti-Semitic, anti-Jewish person. So here's Dr. Schanzer speaking at the committee on April 19th.
This campaign claims to pursue justice for the Palestinians. In truth, many of these groups seek to wage an economic war against Israel. FDD recently completed research that tracked employees from organizations implicated by the federal government for terrorism finance. Our research yielded a troubling outcome in the case of 3 U.S.-based organizations involving the financing of Hamas, a designated terrorist group with a grisly track record of suicide bombings and firing rockets at civilian population, and whose charter openly calls for the annihilation of Israel. The 3 now defunct organizations are Holy Land Foundation for Relief and Development, Kind Hearts for Charitable Humanitarian Development, and the Islamic Association for Palestine. As it turns out, many individuals who previously worked for or on behalf of these groups now work or fundraise for an Illinois-based organization called American Muslims for Palestine, otherwise known as AMP. AMP is arguably the leading BDS organization in the U.S. It is a key sponsor of the anti-Israel campus network known as Students for Justice in Palestine, or SJP.
So he's doing is he's going and he has looked at the Freedom Foundation for the Defense of Democracies that he heads, has gone through and looked at how this is being funded. And what he says is all these organizations, Holy Land Foundation, the Kind Hearts, whatever that means, group, all of these have sort of morphed into this Students for Justice in Palestine, and I think it's American Muslims, AMP, American Muslims for Palestine. And here's some additional testimony.
The groups, the Holy Land Foundation, the Kind Hearts, Islamic Association for Palestine, those were tax-exempt organizations that are now defunct, and there's a new organization in Chicago, American Muslims for Palestine. Are some of the folks that were working with those groups that have been put out of business by the Treasury Department, have they moved over to this new organization still doing the same thing?
Mr. Chairman, we've identified in this testimony that we've got 3 individuals from Holy Land that have moved over to AMP.
Is this new organization, is it a tax-exempt organization as well?
Sure. So 3 from Holy Land, 3 from Islamic Association for Palestine, 1 from Kind Hearts, all now working for AMP, which is pretty significant, we think, when we look at the leadership. Are
they raising money for any terrorist organizations, or do you know?
Not that we know of. What we can tell you is that AMP is a corporate nonprofit. It has a 501c3 that is its fiscal sponsor, so it raises tax-deductible donations, passes them through what's known as AJP, Americans for Justice in Palestine. It passes through to AMP, and then AMP then passes it on to campus. It's quite a structure.
Caroline continues, given SJP's lead role in the campaign against Israel and American Jewry on college campuses, students and Jewish groups trying to combat the racist movement focus their attention on SJP. But it works out that SJP doesn't formally exist. There is no nonprofit group called Students for Justice in Palestine. SJP doesn't file tax forms. It doesn't have a paper trail. In other words, SJP is a ghost organization, an illusion. To bring it down, you need to find its controllers. According to the website, SJP was founded in 2001 by UC Berkeley prof. Hatim Bazian. Bazian's organizational pedigree reads like the who's who of Hamas and Muslim Brotherhood front organizations in America. Brett Stevens then goes back and says, okay, I talked to this guy. I talked to Bazian and asked him to address Mr. Schanzer's specific claims. His response sounds like he's been part of a Democratic presidential campaign, or any presidential campaign for that matter. This is about silencing any person or any group that speaks about Palestine, he said, accusing Mr. Schanzer and the House Foreign Relations Committee of giving McCarthyism a new lease on life. As for the past ties of AMPs, the American Muslims for Palestine leaders, he dismissed it as guilt by association. He used to work for the group. So now, why is that important? You remember, I don't know if it was last, this stuff it's been so much happening lately, it seems to all kind of run together. But there was the person who was in charge of Bernie Sanders' campaign to reach out to Jewish organizations was Simone Zimmerman. And she made some very anti-Israel, anti-Jewish statements. She's Jewish herself. What you don't know, and the backstory of all this is, Simone Zimmerman grew up in a Zionist home. She went to college, guess where? Cal Berkeley, where this Bazian guy is on the faculty. She is now virulently anti-Israel. Now, she's been removed from the campaign, but the point of this is that Jewish students are going to campus and they're being drawn into this. This article in the Jerusalem Post that talks about this says impressionable and susceptible Jewish students, such as Zimmerman, have been systematically indoctrinated at Hillel with messages dehumanizing Israel soldiers, portraying them as war criminals, and describing Israel as an occupying apartheid state committing crimes against humanity. Simone Zimmerman and many other students have been brainwashed and co-opted. They are victims subjected to a systematic and very effective indoctrination at the Campus Jewish Center, presenting itself as a home away from home. This is just the tip of the iceberg. The dire situation is metastasizing across America, and the consequences are grave. So don't think that all the stuff that we criticize Europe for has stayed in Europe. It has migrated to the United States. Now, wouldn't the Justice Department do this? I mean, didn't the Justice Department back in the 2000s prosecute the Holy Land, had the big Holy Land terror funding case? That was a very significant case. They shut down the terror funding. It sent people to prison, some for over 20 years. So I'm sure the Justice Department under the Obama administration has continued that fight, right? So even at NYU, there's a disgrace. And here is Schatzer talking about a poster that's on the wall at a Students for Justice in Palestine office in Illinois. Now, American Muslims for Palestine and SJP, they share the same office address in Illinois. I'm sure that's just a coincidence. I'm sure there's no connection. So here's Schatzer talking about this poster that you'll see on the wall behind these students.
It's also noteworthy that a recent photo from AMP's suburban Chicago headquarters features a poster with the phrase, quote, "No Jew will live among them in Jerusalem," end quote. This sounds a lot like promoting Hamas's agenda here in the United States, if you ask me.
Now, the question is, who is accused of being the apartheid state by these people from SJP and AMP, the pro-Palestinian groups? They accuse Israel of being that way. Yet they're doing this while sitting in front of a poster that says that no Jew will ever live in Jerusalem. Who's the apartheid promoter? It's them. They want a thing that's Judenrein. So what about the... Caroline will deal with the the U.S. Justice Department. Whereas SJP doesn't exist at all on paper, AMP's existence is an eyebrow-raising from a legal perspective. AMP is not registered as a nonprofit, so it is impossible to know its donations because it is not required to publicize them. As Schatzer explained, funds for AMP are raised through yet another organization called Americans for Justice in Palestine Education Foundation, or AJP, whose nature and behavior are also strange. AJP's chairman is Bazian, the guy from Berkeley. AJP and AMP share the same office space in Chicago suburb of Palace Hill. Unlike AMP, AJP is a registered nonprofit, and its 2014 990 tax form attached to Schatzer's testimony, it reports raising in excess of $3.2 million between 2010 and 2014. But in apparent breach of law, AJP did not report how it spent the money or where it received the funds from. Like AMP, AJP members worked in the past for the Holy Land Foundation, the Islamic Association for Palestine, and Kind Hearts. Indeed, most of them are the same people. So she goes on to say, let's see, here's what she says. Schatzer's testimony should lead anti-BDS efforts in 3 directions. 2 of them are legal, and 1 is political. Okay, let's look on the legal front. AMP and JGP's commingling is curious to say the least. Their failure to report the source of their funding or how the funds are used appear at a minimum to be a breach of reporting requirements. These irregularities, along with the fact that the officers of these organizations were in the past officers of organizations disbanded due to their provision of material support for terrorism, warrant criminal investigation by both tax authorities and counterterrorism investigators. Unfortunately, shortly after he entered office in 2009, Barack Obama, then Attorney General Eric Holder, ordered the Department of Justice to stop investigating Islamist nonprofit groups. Accordingly, it is highly unlikely that any investigation will be conducted by federal agencies in the near future. On the political front, it is vital that Israel fight BDS as the most widespread form of anti-Semitism in North America. Unlike the situation in Europe, where BDS is largely an economic warfare campaign, in the U.S., its goal is political. Its leaders are not interested in harming the Israeli economy per se. They are interested in cultivating anti-Semitism and hatred of Israel to pave the way for economic warfare and actual war against Israel. Government ministries involved in the fight against BDS need to be, those are Israeli government ministers, involved in the fight against BDS need to provide anti-BDS activists with information about SJP's link to Hamas and with the Palestinian Authority. American Jewish organizations and activists need to call out college administrators when they say, since they refuse to carry out divestment resolutions, that they oppose BDS, even as they allow SJP to operate on their campuses and even fund the Hamas front group directly. Schatzer's testimony makes clear that the BDS movement is part and parcel of the jihadist war against Israel, whose goal is its annihilation, both legally and politically. It needs to be fought accordingly. And then this report, and I'll finish with this. This is from one of the security officials in Brussels. And this gentleman, Koen Geens, told the European Parliament that Europe will shortly have more Muslims than Christians. Now, that doesn't include, of course, Christians are a shrinking minority in Europe because of the secularization of Europe. But that's a significant development. Because who's going to control the political process? And frankly, how often is it difficult to determine the difference between the Islamic political agenda and the left's political agenda, the secular political agenda? Very often they're the same. So all of this is a way of saying is that, look, this is a very significant time in prophetic history because we are seeing this growing rage against the people of Israel, against the Jews. And we know where this is all going to end up, and we all know that this is all going to play out. But the whole world is being educated and moved to that position. That's a very significant development. So pay attention to that. We'll try to provide links to these articles in the YouTube channel description, and we'll pick up with some of these things next week. I have about 50 more slides, but you don't want to sit here and look at those. So let's pray. Father, I pray that you will help us to stand as bold prophetic witnesses of the time that we live in, that this is the season when people need to turn to God, because the time to do that may be very short. Pray that you will give us that boldness to stand for that truth and to share it with our friends and families. Bless us this week. In Jesus' name, amen.